The moment Letitia Holloway walked into the Silver Spur Saloon in Redemption Creek, Texas, on a blistering August afternoon in 1878, every conversation died like a candle snuffed by wind, and she felt the weight of every pair of eyes in the room settle on her like a brand. She did not flinch. She had learned long ago that flinching only invited wolves. Letitia was 24 years old, with dark chestnut hair pinned under a sun-bleached bonnet, green eyes the color of sage after rain, and a jaw set with the kind of quiet determination that comes from surviving things other people only read about in dime novels. She wore a practical calico dress the color of dusty blue sky, and her boots were cracked at the toe from too many miles of hard ground. She carried a small leather satchel over one arm and a sealed letter in her other hand, and she walked directly toward the bar because she needed information, and the barkeeper always had it. Redemption Creek was not a gentle town. It sat along the banks of a muddy creek in the hill country of central Texas, where cattle drives carved the land into rivers of dust and commerce, where drovers and gamblers and land speculators rubbed elbows with homesteaders and widows, and the occasional traveling preacher who never stayed long enough to do much good. It was the kind of town that had sprung up overnight around a water source and a trading post, and had never quite grown into anything better than what it started as, but it had a post office and a general store and a doctor who was only occasionally drunk, and for Letitia's purposes, that was enough. She needed to find a man named Chester Prout. Chester Prout was the foreman at the Holloway cattle operation, which had been her father's ranch before her father had died 8 months ago from a fever that took him in 4 days. The ranch, the cattle, the deed to 340 acres of hill country land, all of it should have passed to Letitia as the only surviving heir. Her mother had died when Letitia was 12. She had no brothers, no uncles, no cousins close enough to contest. The will her father had drawn up with the attorney in Austin had been clear, but Chester Prout had the will. He also had, according to the letter she had received 3 weeks ago from her father's old friend Judge Whitmore in Austin, 2 signed affidavits claiming that Letitia's father had made a secondary arrangement leaving the ranch to Prout himself, in exchange for some debt her father allegedly owed. Judge Whitmore did not believe the affidavits were genuine. Neither did Letitia. But belief was not the same as proof, and proving it required her to be present in Redemption Creek before Prout could finalize the transfer of deed at the county land office, which was scheduled to happen in 4 days. 4 days. She had ridden 3 days straight from San Antonio, where she had been working as a seamstress since her father's funeral, sending money back to the ranch hands who were staying on out of loyalty. 4 days to sort out a fraud, reclaim her inheritance, and figure out what to do with a 340-acre cattle ranch that she had not lived on in 2 years. She reached the bar and set the sealed letter on the polished wood surface with a deliberate click. The barkeeper was a broad man with a handlebar mustache and eyes the color of old copper. He looked at her letter, then at her, then at her letter again. "I am looking for Chester Prout," Letitia said, keeping her voice even. "I understand he drinks here of an evening. I need to know if he is in town and where he is staying." "Chester Prout is a dangerous man to go looking for, miss," the barkeeper said, not unkindly. "You sure that is the direction you want to point yourself?" "I am sure," she said. The barkeeper leaned in slightly. "He has got himself 3 ranch hands who ride with him everywhere he goes, big boys, not the friendliest sort. Where is he staying?" The barkeeper studied her for a long moment, then sighed like a man who had decided that whatever was about to happen was not his fault. "He took a room at the Red Hawk Hotel 2 days ago. He has been spending his evenings here, usually comes in around 7. It is barely past 4, so you have got some time." "Thank you," Letitia said, and she picked up her letter and turned to find a table. It was then that she nearly collided with the chest of Ezekiel Monroe. She stepped back and looked up, which was something she did not often have to do because she was not a short woman. But Ezekiel Monroe stood well over 6 feet, with broad shoulders that filled the doorway he had just stepped through, dark hair pushed back under a worn cavalry hat with a dented crown, and eyes the color of dark amber that caught the thin light from the saloon's windows and held it. He was lean in the way that working men are lean, with calloused hands and the kind of sun-darkened skin that comes from years spent outdoors. He wore a plain cotton shirt, dark trousers, boots that had seen serious use, and a Colt single-action Army revolver holstered at his hip, which was not unusual for the time and place but which she noticed anyway. He had clearly noticed her, too. He pulled his hat off in a single smooth motion and held it at his side, and he looked at her with an expression that was careful and warm all at once, like a man who had learned to feel things quietly so the world would not take them from him. "My apologies, ma'am," he said. His voice was low and easy, with the slow cadence of someone who had grown up somewhere with long summers. "I was not watching where I was going." "Nor was I," Letitia said, which was not entirely true but was polite enough. She stepped around him toward the table in the corner, the one that had a clear line of sight to the door and to the bar, and she sat down and opened her satchel and began reviewing the papers inside, because she had work to do, and approximately 3 hours before Chester Pruitt arrived, and she intended to spend that time being prepared rather than being distracted by strangers. She was doing fairly well at that intention until the stranger sat down across from her. She looked up. Ezekiel Monroe was looking at her with that same careful, warm expression, and he had set his hat on the table between them and folded his hands on top of it in a gesture that managed to be both relaxed and attentive. "You are going to tell me to move," he said. "I am going to tell you to move," she confirmed. "I will in a moment," he said. "But first, would you let me ask you something?" She looked at him steadily. There was nothing threatening in his manner. She had learned to read men the way she had learned to read weather out of necessity, and this one read as sincere rather than dangerous. That did not mean she intended to spend her afternoon making conversation. "Ask," she said. "Are you all right?" he said. "You came in here like a woman with something heavy on her shoulders, and you sat down in that corner chair like a woman who does not trust the room. And I have been watching the door, and I can tell you that whatever you are waiting for has not come through it yet, so I thought I would ask if you were all right before I moved along." Letitia blinked. She had been called many things since her father died: brave, stubborn, foolish, determined. She had not recently been asked, simply and without agenda, if she was all right. "I am managing," she said, which was the most honest thing she could offer. He nodded like that answer made sense to him. "My name is Ezekiel Monroe," he said. "I am passing through Redemption Creek on my way north. I used to work a cattle drive out of the Rio Grande Valley before the company disbanded. I am heading up toward Abilene to look at some land." He said all of this matter-of-factly, like a man introducing himself to a neighbor over a fence, without any of the performative swagger she had come to expect from men in saloons. "You do not have to tell me your name or your business. I am just giving you mine so you know who is talking to you." She looked at him for another moment. Then she said, "Letitia Holloway, and I am here on a legal matter that I need to resolve in the next 4 days." "Legal matter," he repeated, not like he was prying, but like he was filing the information away carefully. "Yes," she said. "Is it the kind of legal matter that might become dangerous?" he asked. She considered lying. Then she considered that she was in a strange town with no allies and 4 days, and a man named Chester Pruitt who had 3 large friends and had already demonstrated a willingness to falsify legal documents. "It might," she said. Ezekiel Monroe nodded slowly. "Then I will stay close," he said, "if you do not mind, not to interfere, just to be present." "You do not know me," Letitia said. "No," he agreed. "But I know the look of someone who needs another set of eyes, and I have got 2 that are not currently spoken for." She should have sent him away. She should have told him she did not need assistance, and that she was perfectly capable of handling her own affairs, both of which were true. But there was something about the straightforward simplicity of the offer that she found difficult to refuse, and the practical part of her mind, the part that had kept her alive and solvent for 8 months on her own, pointed out quietly that having someone present who was not connected to Prute's operation could only be an advantage. "All right," she said, "but you stay out of it unless I need you." "Yes, ma'am," he said, and there was just the ghost of a smile at the corner of his mouth, not mocking, something warmer than that, as he settled back in his chair and turned his amber eyes toward the door. They sat together in the corner of the Silver Spur Saloon for the next 2.5 hours, and in that time they talked more than Letitia had intended to. She told him about the ranch, about her father, about the forged affidavits and Chester Prute's scheme to steal 340 acres of land from a woman who had no family to stand with her. She told him because it was easier to explain quickly and trust him with the facts than to explain slowly later if things went wrong. And as she talked, she realized that she was watching his face and finding in it a quality she had not often seen in men, which was the quality of actually listening. He told her things too, in that measured, unhurried way of his. He told her he was 30 years old. He told her he had come up from the Rio Grande Valley, where he had worked cattle drives and done some scouting for a land company until the company had gone under in a bad season. He told her his father had been a rancher in New Mexico territory and had died when a fence line dispute had turned ugly, and that he had spent the years since then working other people's land and thinking about what it would mean to have his own. He told her this without bitterness, which she found remarkable, because she had met men with far less cause for bitterness who had let it hollow them out. He did not tell her she should have a husband to handle this for her. He did not look at the papers she showed him with the skeptical expression she had encountered from the Austin attorney she had consulted, the one who had looked at her like she might not understand what she was reading. He read the forged affidavit she showed him with the focused attention of someone who was taking the problem seriously, and when he looked up he said, "The signature on the second affidavit is different from the first. Look at the way the capital H curves on Holloway. They are not from the same hand." She looked. He was right. She had noticed it before but had not been certain, and having someone else confirm it settled something in her chest. "That is exactly what Judge Whitmore said," she told him. "Then you have your argument," Ezekiel said. "You need to be at the land office before the transfer is filed, and you need someone in authority to look at those signatures side by side." "The county sheriff," Letitia said. "I have an appointment with him tomorrow morning." "Good," Ezekiel said. And then Chester Prute walked through the door of the Silver Spur Saloon and everything shifted. Prute was a thick-necked man of about 50, with a florid face and small eyes set close together under heavy brows. He wore a good suit that did not quite fit him properly, like a man who had recently come into money and had not yet learned how to wear it. He was flanked by 2 large men whose expressions suggested they were employed primarily to look threatening, and a third man followed close behind them, a lean, ferret-faced individual in a gray coat who Letitia recognized as the so-called notary whose name appeared on the forged affidavits. She felt her spine straighten and her jaw set. Prute scanned the room the way powerful men do, not looking for threats specifically, just cataloging the space and its occupants as a habit of dominance. His gaze passed over her and stopped, and she watched him calculate who she was, and she saw the moment he recognized her. He came directly toward her table. Ezekiel Monroe did not move, but Letitia felt a subtle shift in him, the way a still horse shifts its weight when it scents something on the wind. He was watching Prute with those amber eyes, calm and absolutely attentive. "Letitia Holloway," Prute said, stopping in front of her table with his hands in his coat pockets and his small eyes moving between her and Ezekiel. "I did not expect you to come all the way out here. Thought you were settled in San Antonio." "I have business at the Redemption Creek Land Office," she said pleasantly, "as I imagine you know." "That business is already settled," Prute said. His voice was smooth, almost friendly, which was worse than hostility because it implied confidence. "Your father made his arrangements before he passed. The affidavits are legal and witnessed. The transfer is being filed Thursday morning." Thursday morning I will also be at the land office, Letitia said, with documentation from Judge Whitmore in Austin, who has reviewed the affidavits in question and has several concerns about their authenticity that he has already communicated to the county sheriff. Pruitt's expression did not change, but something behind his eyes did. Your father owed me a debt, he said. My father kept meticulous records, Letitia replied. I have reviewed them. There is no record of any debt to you. There was a pause, and then Pruitt looked at Ezekiel with the deliberate slowness of a man who has decided to redirect his calculation. Who is this? He said. A friend, Letitia said, before Ezekiel could answer. A friend, Pruitt repeated with a faint sneer. You need a friend to fight your battles for you, girl. I am not fighting any battles, she said. I am attending a land office appointment. Friends come along for lots of things. Pruitt looked at Ezekiel one more time, long and measuring, and Ezekiel looked back at him with an expression of perfect, unruffled calm that Letitia suspected was doing more to unsettle Pruitt than anything she could have said. Then Pruitt made a small sound that was not quite a laugh and turned away, taking his men with him to a table on the far side of the room. Letitia let out a slow, controlled breath. Well, Ezekiel said quietly, now he knows you are here. Good, she said, though her heart was hammering in a way she did not intend to acknowledge. I wanted him to know. Ezekiel looked at her with something in his expression that was not quite admiration and not quite concern, but was somewhere in the warm territory between the two. You are not easily frightened, he said. I am easily frightened, she corrected. I am just better at moving through it than around it. He looked at her for a moment with an expression that shifted into something more open, something she did not have a name for yet, and then he looked away toward the window, and the late afternoon light caught the line of his jaw and the angle of his cheekbones, and Letitia told herself firmly to pay attention to the problem at hand. She gathered her papers, tucked them back into her satchel, and rose from the table. I need to go to the hotel and rest before tomorrow, she said. I want to be sharp for the sheriff. Ezekiel stood when she did, which was the kind of instinctive courtesy she had noticed about him and which she found, against her better judgment, rather appealing. I will walk you there, he said, not to intrude, just to see you safe. She looked at him. It is a short walk, he added, and Pruitt's men are watching the door. She looked toward the bar. He was right. The ferret-faced man in the gray coat had not ordered a drink. He was watching them. All right, she said. Thank you. They walked out of the Silver Spur into the long gold light of a Texas August evening, when the heat has not quite broken but has gentled slightly, and the air smells of dust and cedar and the distant promise of cooler dark. The street was busy with the end-of-day traffic of a working town, drovers moving cattle through the far end, wagons rattling over the rutted main road, women from the boarding houses bringing washing in from the lines. Letitia walked at a brisk pace and Ezekiel walked beside her, matching her stride without crowding her, which she appreciated. The Red Hawk Hotel is where I am staying as well, he said as they turned the corner. Is it the only hotel in town? She asked. There is a boarding house on 2nd Street, he said, but the Red Hawk is cleaner. Mrs. Delacroix runs it. She does not allow drinking in the rooms and she makes a decent supper. You have been here before, Letitia observed. Once 2 years ago, he said, on the drive south. They reached the Red Hawk Hotel, which was a 2-story wooden building with a painted sign and a wide front porch where 2 old men were playing checkers in the cooling air. Mrs. Delacroix herself was behind the front desk, a stout Cajun woman of about 60 with iron-gray hair and quick dark eyes who looked Letitia over with the efficiency of someone who had seen everything and had opinions about most of it. Miss Holloway, she said, which meant the room had been reserved ahead. Room 5 upstairs. Supper is at 7. Mr. Monroe, you are already checked in. She looked between them with an expression that was not quite a smile. I run a respectable establishment. I know you do, Mrs. Delacroix, Ezekiel said. Miss Holloway is here on business. I am simply making sure she got here safely. Said Mrs. Delacroix. Letitia received her room key and climbed the stairs, and at the top of the landing she paused and looked back at Ezekiel, who was still standing at the bottom watching her with that careful, warm expression. "Thank you," she said, "for today." "Sleep well," he said. "Tomorrow will be a full day." She went to her room and sat on the edge of the narrow bed and let herself, for just a moment, feel the full weight of what she was carrying. The grief of her father, 8 months old and not any lighter for the passing of time. The fear of losing the land he had built over 30 years of hard work. The exhaustion of fighting alone. She let herself feel it, and then she set it aside with the practiced discipline of someone who could not afford to drown in it. And she opened her satchel and reviewed her documents one more time by the light of the oil lamp until she was certain she knew every page by heart. She fell asleep with the lamp still burning and dreamed, unexpectedly, of nothing frightening at all. Morning came hard and bright, the way Texas mornings do in August, with a sun that hit the horizon like a hammer and a heat that arrived before most people were ready for it. Letitia was dressed and downstairs before 7, fortified herself with Mrs. Delacroix's strong coffee and a plate of scrambled eggs and cornbread, and was reviewing her papers at the dining table when Ezekiel appeared at the bottom of the stairs. He had shaved. She noticed this only because it changed the line of his jaw in a way that made him look slightly younger and considerably more human, which was counterproductive to her concentration, so she looked back at her papers. "Morning," he said, settling into the chair across from her with his own coffee. "How did you sleep?" "Well enough," she said. "The sheriff's office opens at 8. "I know," he said. "I will come with you if you want. Stand in the back and not say anything unless you need me to." She looked up at him. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. "You have your own business to attend to. You are heading to Abilene. You have no stake in what happens here." He was quiet for a moment, wrapping his hands around his coffee cup and looking at the table. Then he looked up at her, and there was something in his eyes that was more direct than anything he had said before. "My father's land was taken from him," he said. "Legally, more or less, by men who knew how to use the law like a weapon against people who did not have lawyers or family or anyone to stand with them. He spent 2 years trying to get it back, and it killed him before he could." He paused. "I am not saying your situation is the same, but when I see something that looks like it, I have a hard time walking away." Letitia looked at him for a long moment. She thought about her father, about the meticulous records he had kept, about the way he had always said that a man who kept good records was a man who trusted in justice. She thought about how Chester Pruitt was betting that justice was too slow and too expensive and too indifferent for a 24-year-old woman on her own to access it in time. "All right," she said. "Come with me." The sheriff's office was a low adobe building on the east side of the main street, with iron bars on the single window and a wooden sign that read Sheriff W. Calloway in uneven letters. Sheriff William Calloway turned out to be a lean man of about 55 with a silver star pinned to a worn vest and the permanently cautious expression of a man who had mediated too many disputes between people who were certain they were right. He listened to Letitia's account without interrupting her, studied the documents she spread across his desk with a magnifying lens he produced from a drawer, and spent a considerable amount of time looking at the 2 signatures on the forged affidavits. "The H is different," he said finally. "Yes, sir," Letitia said. He looked at her over the magnifying lens. "Your father's genuine signature is on the deed and on the original will, both of which I can verify from county records," he said. "If these 2 affidavits have a different hand, that is a problem for Pruitt." He set the lens down. "I'm going to send a wire to Austin this morning to confirm your Judge Whitmore's account. If it checks out, I will be at the land office Thursday morning myself." "Thank you, Sheriff," Letitia said. As they walked out into the morning heat, Ezekiel let out a long breath. "Good," he said. "That is good." "It is progress," she said carefully. "It is not finished." "No," he agreed, "but it is progress." They walked along the main street in the warming morning, and Letitia, who had been conducting herself with the focused intensity of someone managing a crisis, found that the slight easing of tension left room for other things to surface. Things like the fact that the morning air smelled of baking bread from the general store, and that the sky was that particular deep blue that only happens in Texas in the early hours before the heat bleaches it, and that the man walking beside her had a way of occupying space that was somehow both substantial and unobtrusive, and that she was acutely aware of the small distance between his arm and hers. "Tell me about the ranch," he said. "Not the legal situation, the ranch itself." She glanced at him. "Why?" "Because you have been talking about it like a problem to be solved," he said. "I want to know what it is like." She was quiet for a moment, and then she found herself talking, really talking, in a way she had not done in months. She told him about the house, a limestone ranch house her father had built with his own hands over 3 summers, low-ceilinged and cool in summer and warm in winter, with a wide porch facing west so you could watch the sun go down over the hills. She told him about the spring-fed pond in the lower pasture where white-tailed deer came to drink at dawn. She told him about the pecan grove along the creek and the way the light came through the branches in October, golden and slow, and how her father used to say that was what heaven probably looked like, just more of that same light without the end of it. She did not mean to say all of that. She said it anyway. Ezekiel listened without interrupting. When she stopped, he said, "That sounds like a place worth fighting for." She looked at him. "Yes," she said softly, "it is." They had stopped walking somewhere along this conversation, and she realized they were standing at the edge of the street near the livery stable, and she had been talking like there was no one else in the world to talk to, which was an unfamiliar feeling and not an unwelcome one. She cleared her throat and adjusted the satchel on her arm. "I need to visit the general store," she said. "There are a few things I need." "I will walk with you," he said, "unless you need to be alone." "I do not need to be alone," she said, and that was also truer than she had intended. The general store was run by a Mr. and Mrs. Lofton, a couple in their 40s who knew everyone in Redemption Creek and everyone's business, and who received Letitia with the barely concealed curiosity of people who had already heard she was in town. While she negotiated for writing paper and a fresh ink pen and a few other small necessities, Ezekiel wandered the store and came back to the counter with a small jar of peppermint candies, which he set on the counter alongside her items. "What is that for?" she asked. "I like peppermint," he said simply, and paid for it himself. Outside the store, he offered her one, holding the open jar toward her with a look that was so straightforward and guileless that she found herself smiling before she could stop it. She took one. It was sharp and sweet and cold on her tongue, and the sensation of something purely pleasant after days of tension and travel was so unexpected that she laughed, a real laugh, short and surprised. Ezekiel Monroe looked at her with an expression that she did not know how to read, something open and quiet and very still, like a man who has just heard something he did not expect to hear but very much wanted to. "You have a good laugh," he said. She stopped laughing and looked at him. He held her gaze without wavering, and there was nothing forward or presumptuous in his expression, only something honest that he did not seem to be trying to hide. She looked away first, toward the far end of the street, where a rider was coming in from the south. "I need to write a letter to Judge Whitmore," she said. "Let him know where things stand." "Of course," he said, and they walked back toward the hotel with the jar of peppermint candies, and the question of what exactly was happening between them sitting unasked in the warm morning air. The next day passed in the methodical way of waiting, which is to say it was full of small actions and large anxiety. Letitia wrote her letter to Judge Whitmore and had it sent by the afternoon post. She spoke again with Sheriff Calloway, who confirmed that his wire to Austin had received a reply confirming Judge Whitmore's account and expressing the judge's strong opinion that the affidavits bore further examination. She walked the town in the afternoon, learning its geography the way her father had taught her to learn any terrain, identifying the bank, the telegraph office, the land office itself, a low building near the courthouse that she walked past twice and studied carefully. Chester Pruitt was conspicuously visible throughout the day, taking meals at the hotel dining room and spending his evenings at the Silver Spur, which she suspected was deliberate. He wanted her to see him being comfortable, being confident, occupying the space. She matched him by being equally visible and equally calm, though the calmness cost her something. That evening, after supper, she and Ezekiel sat on the front porch of the Red Hawk Hotel in the cooling dark, on the 2 wooden rocking chairs that Mrs. Delacroix kept there, and Letitia told him things she had not told anyone. She told him about the day she had gotten the letter about her father's death, how she had been sitting in the back room of the seamstress shop where she worked, hemming a dress for a merchant's wife, and how the word had arrived, and how she had set the dress down very carefully and folded her hands in her lap and sat absolutely still for a long time, because she did not know how to be a person whose father was dead. Ezekiel listened to all of it. He did not offer empty comfort or practical solutions. He just listened, and at one point, when her voice had gone quieter than usual and the night insects were very loud around them, he said, "I understand that stillness. I sat in the same place when my father died, that stillness where the world has changed and you have not caught up to it yet." "Yes," she said, "exactly that." They were quiet for a while, and it was not an uncomfortable quiet. Then she said, because the evening and the porch in the dark had loosened something in her that daylight kept closed, "I have been so alone in this. I do not mean that as complaint. I made choices that led here and I do not regret them, but it has been very alone." "I know," he said, and the simplicity of it was more comforting than any long speech would have been. She looked at him in the darkness. The lamp from the parlor window made a warm rectangle of gold on the porch floor between them, and his profile against the dark street was clear and quiet. "I should not be telling you all of this," she said. "Why not?" he asked. "Because I have known you for 2 days," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Sometimes 2 days is enough to know what matters about a person, and sometimes 20 years is not enough." He paused. "I think I know what matters about you." "What do you think you know?" she asked, and she meant it as a genuine question. He looked at her directly, and there was that openness again, that quality of not hiding. "I know that you are brave in a way that is real rather than performed," he said. "I know that you loved your father deeply, and that his death left a wound in you that has not healed, but that you do not let that wound stop you. I know that you are smart, and that you do not need anyone to fight your battles, only someone to stand with you while you fight them yourself. And I know that you have a laugh that sounds like something surprising and good, and that you do not use it often enough." Letitia was quiet for a very long moment. "That is quite a lot to know in 2 days, she said finally. "Yes, ma'am," he agreed. She looked away toward the dark street and told herself that the warmth she was feeling was the residual heat of the August evening, and had nothing whatsoever to do with the man sitting 2 feet away from her in the other rocking chair. She did not entirely believe herself. "Tell me about the land in Abilene," she said, because she needed to say something, and this seemed like safe ground. He talked then about the land he had been researching, a parcel northwest of Abilene where the grass was good and the water was reliable, where a man could run a modest cattle operation and make it work with the right effort. He talked about it with the same quality of careful hope that she had noticed in him from the beginning, like someone who wanted something real and was going about wanting it in a deliberate and serious way. He was not a man of grand ambitions, she understood. He was a man of genuine ones, which was rarer. She found herself thinking, without meaning to, that the hill country of central Texas also had good grass and reliable water, and that 340 acres was a reasonable size for a modest cattle operation. And then she stopped thinking that because it was too large a leap from too small a foundation, and she was not the kind of woman who made large leaps without solid ground under her. The morning of the 3rd day brought a complication. Letitia came down to breakfast to find Ezekiel already at the table with a serious expression and a folded note that he slid toward her when she sat down, "Found that under my door this morning," he said. She opened it. It was unsigned, written in block letters on plain paper. "Tell the girl to go home. The deed is decided. Things will go easier for everyone if she leaves today." Letitia set the note down on the table with careful, deliberate steadiness. She looked at it for a moment. Then she picked up her coffee cup and took a long sip. "No," she said. Ezekiel was watching her. There was something in his expression, a concern that was not the careful, observational concern of the past 2 days, but something more personal, something that caused him to feel and did not try to hide it. "This means they are nervous," he said. "Nervous people sometimes do reckless things." "I know," she said. "Also not leaving." "I did not think you were," he said. "But I want you to know that I am not going anywhere either." She looked at him across the table. The morning light was coming in through the hotel dining room window, and it showed her his face clearly, the amber eyes steady on hers, the set of his jaw that was not aggressive but was definite, the way he looked at her like she was the most important thing in his line of sight, and like he was not going to look away. She thought of the night on the porch. She thought of 2 days that had somehow held more genuine conversation than some years she could name. "Ezekiel," she said, and she watched something shift in his expression when she used his full name rather than the formal address she had been defaulting to. "Why are you staying?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Because I cannot seem to make myself want to be anywhere else." She held his gaze. There was a long pause, weighted with everything that had been building since she had nearly walked into his chest in the Silver Spur saloon, and then she said, "That is not entirely unhelpful to know." And she returned to her coffee and her breakfast, and he returned to his, and the morning light continued to come through the window, and the day continued to build around them. They spent the morning taking the anonymous note to Sheriff Calloway, who received it with the grim satisfaction of a man whose suspicions have been confirmed, and wrote it into his record. He also told them that he had received a second wire from Austin, this one directly from the state attorney general's office, indicating that Chester Pruitt had a prior record in Bixar County of filing fraudulent land claims, a matter that had been settled financially and without formal charges but which was very much relevant to the current situation. "I will be at that land office at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning," the sheriff said, "and I will have a deputy with me." "Thank you, Sheriff," Letitia said. Walking back from the sheriff's office, Letitia felt something she had not felt in 8 months. Not victory, not yet because it was not finished, but the shape of something that might become victory, the outline of it visible against the horizon. She thought of the limestone ranch house with its west-facing porch. She thought of the deer at the spring-fed pond at dawn. She thought of the man walking beside her and wondered what he would think of the pecan grove in October. She stopped that thought firmly before it could go any further. In the afternoon, Chester Pruitt found them. They had been walking back from the land office, where Letitia had spoken to the registrar and confirmed her appointment for the following morning, when Pruitt stepped out of the alley between the telegraph office and the barber shop and blocked their path on the boardwalk. His 2 large hands were not present, but the ferret-faced notary was behind him, and there was a tightness around Pruitt's eyes that had not been there at the Silver Spur on the first day. "Miss Holloway," he said, "we need to talk." "I am listening," she said, stopping. Ezekiel stopped beside her. "I am going to offer you a settlement," Pruitt said. "The deed transfers tomorrow, that is happening. But I will give you $500 for the inconvenience, and you can take that and go back to San Antonio, and no one has to make this any uglier than it needs to be. $500 for 340 acres of prime hill country land," she said. "That is not a settlement. That is an insult." "It is what you are going to get," Pruitt said, and his voice had dropped into something with an edge in it. "Chester," she said, using his first name deliberately, because she had grown up on that ranch and he had been her father's employee, and she would not allow him to pretend to a superiority he had not earned. "I have a letter from Judge Whitmore, documentation from the county records, a verification from the state attorney general's office, and the sheriff's personal attention on this matter. Your affidavits were written in 2 different hands, which is going to be pointed out to the land office registrar at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. I suggest you take the night to think carefully about your position." There was a long pause. Prout looked at her, and then he looked at Ezekiel, and Ezekiel was doing the thing he did very well, which was simply being present in a way that was completely calm and absolutely immovable, like a very large, very quiet fact of geography. "Who are you?" Prout said to him. "What is your stake in this?" "He is with me," Letitia said. "She asked you a question," Ezekiel said pleasantly to Prout. "She did not ask you one. You might want to respect that distinction." Prout's jaw tightened. He looked between them again, and something in his expression changed, became calculating in a way that she did not quite like, and then he made a small, dismissive gesture and stepped aside. "We will see how tomorrow goes," he said. They went around him on the boardwalk and continued down the street, and Letitia did not look back. She walked straight and even, and Ezekiel matched her, and she was aware of him very precisely in the way that you are aware of something solid when everything else feels uncertain. When they had turned the corner and were out of Prout's line of sight, she stopped and let out a breath that shook slightly at its edges. "You are doing exactly what needs to be done," Ezekiel said quietly. "I know," she said. "I am still afraid." "I know," he said. "That is what I said. You are doing exactly what needs to be done." She looked at him. There was a moment between them, standing on the corner of the main street of Redemption Creek in the afternoon heat, where the world narrowed to just the two of them and the small space between them, and she thought with sudden and absolute clarity that she had not wanted to be close to someone in a long time, and that she very much wanted to be close to this particular someone, and that this was not convenient and not simple and probably not wise. "Tell me something good," she said. It came out before she thought it through. He looked at her, surprised and then not surprised, and he said, "The light in October in a pecan grove." She stared at him. He had been listening. Of course he had been listening. He had been listening to everything she said. She felt something loosen in her chest that she had not known was held tight. "Yes," she said softly. "That is a very good something." They had supper at the hotel that evening with a quiet between them that had changed in quality, had become less careful and more comfortable, and Mrs. Delacroix watched them over the serving of her lamb stew with an expression that was composed primarily of satisfaction. After supper, Letitia went to the porch again, and Ezekiel followed, and they sat in the rocking chairs again under the stars, and she said, "After tomorrow, if this goes the way I believe it will, I will need to go back to the ranch and sort out everything that Prout has mismanaged in 8 months. "That will take some time," he said. "Yes," she said, "it will." There was a pause. "The land in Abilene," she said carefully. "Have you made any commitments to it? Any signed agreements?" "Not yet," he said, equally carefully. "I have been corresponding with the seller. Nothing is finalized." "I see," she said. "Do you?" He asked, and there was something in the question that was both gentle and direct, very like the man himself. She looked at him. The porch light and the stars were doing something pleasant to the line of his face, and she was 24 years old and had been alone for 8 months and had been carrying something very heavy, and the most honest thing she could think of to say was what she said, which was, "I think I am developing a very significant problem." "What kind of problem?" he asked. "The kind that is 6 feet tall and has amber eyes and brings peppermint candies and listens to everything I say," she said. He was very still for a moment. Then he said, "That does sound like a significant problem." "Yes," she said. "I have the same problem," he said. "Mine is about 5'7" with green eyes and a jaw like a woman who does not intend to be told no, and she told me her name on the first day, and I have not been able to think about much else since." She looked at him, and he looked at her, and the evening was very warm and the stars were very clear, and Letitia said, "What are we going to do about it?" "I have some thoughts," he said, "but I think tomorrow should come first. There is an important morning ahead of you." She looked at him for a moment longer, and she thought that this was a man who put the right things in the right order, who understood what needed to come first and said so without resentment or hesitation, and that this was not a small thing. "All right," she said. "Tomorrow first." She went upstairs. She lay in the narrow bed in room 5 of the Red Hawk Hotel and looked at the ceiling and felt, for the first time in 8 months, something that was not grief or fear or determination or exhaustion. It was something warmer than any of those things. She did not name it. She went to sleep. Thursday morning arrived with a sky the color of polished copper at its eastern edge, the sun not yet up but announcing itself with considerable authority. Letitia was dressed and downstairs by 6:30, and Ezekiel was already at the table with coffee and a plate of cornbread and the focused, settled expression of a man who had decided how to spend his day and was comfortable with the decision. "Ready?" he asked. "Yes," she said. She meant it. They reached the land office at 7:50. Sheriff Calloway was already there with a deputy at his shoulder, a young man of about 22 who was clearly taking notes. The land office registrar, a small, precise man named Mr. Alderton, was opening his shutters and looked at the assembled group with the resigned expression of a man who had expected a routine Thursday, and was now understanding that this was not going to be one. Chester Prout arrived at 8 o'clock precisely, with his ferret-faced notary and his 2 large men, and he stopped on the threshold of the land office and looked at the sheriff and the deputy and Letitia and Ezekiel and Mr. Alderton, and his expression went through several stages in quick succession before settling on something that was trying to be confident and was not quite getting there. "Sheriff," he said. "Chester," Sheriff Calloway replied. "Glad you are here. We have some things to discuss before Mr. Alderton processes anything this morning." What followed was one of the more precise and thorough examinations of handwriting that Letitia had ever witnessed. Mr. Alderton, who had a magnifying lens considerably more powerful than the sheriff's, compared the 2 affidavit signatures against the original deed signature, and the will signature with the methodical care of a man who loved documentation the way some men loved horses. He said nothing for a very long time. Then he set down the lens and looked at Chester Prout. "The signatures on the affidavits are not consistent with the verified signature of one Daniel Holloway," he said. "The capital H presents differently in both instances. The curve on the lower case is distinct. I cannot in good conscience register a transfer of deed based on documents I cannot verify as authentic." "They were witnessed," Prout said, his voice harder now, the smooth confidence peeling back from something less pleasant underneath. "By me," said the ferret-faced notary, who had been attempting to be invisible in the corner. "And what is your name and your notary license number?" Sheriff Calloway asked him, producing a notebook. The notary gave both. The sheriff wrote them down. "That license was suspended in Travis County 18 months ago for falsification," the sheriff said. "I checked this morning." The room was very quiet. Letitia stood in the middle of it with her documents in her hands and her heart hammering and her face entirely composed, and she felt Ezekiel beside her, a foot to her right and slightly back, present and steady, and she thought that she would remember this moment for the rest of her life. Chester Prout looked at her. For a moment, all his calculation dropped away and he just looked at her, and she saw in his expression something that was almost, but not quite, shame. "My father was a good man," she said to him, quietly but clearly. "He employed you for 11 years. Whatever debt you thought he owed you, this was not the way to collect it." Prout said nothing. Sheriff Calloway stepped forward. There were some formal things said, some formal things done, and in the end Chester Prout and his notary left the land office with considerably more legal trouble than they had entered it with, and Mr. Alderton formally recorded the existing deed in Letitia Holloway's name, complete and uncontested, as it had always been. She held the recorded copy in her hands. It was a plain piece of paper with official words on it, and she held it like it weighed nothing and everything at the same time. She heard Ezekiel exhale beside her, a long, quiet breath, and she looked up at him. He was looking at her with an expression that was so unguarded and warm that it made her breath catch, and he said very simply, "It is yours." "It is mine," she agreed, and her voice cracked slightly on the last word just enough, and she did not mind. Sheriff Calloway shook her hand and told her she had handled herself admirably. Mr. Alderton told her the county records were updated, and she was welcome to request certified copies at any time. The young deputy opened the door for her with a slightly awed expression, and Ezekiel walked out beside her into the brilliant, punishing, glorious Texas morning sunlight. She stopped on the boardwalk outside the land office and tilted her face up to the sky for a moment and closed her eyes and breathed. She heard him stop beside her. She heard the quiet of him, the particular stillness he carried. She opened her eyes and looked at him. "I need to go home," she said. "I need to go back to the ranch." "Yes," he said. "There is a great deal to do," she said. "The cattle need to be assessed. The hands need to be paid properly. The house needs attention. The accounts need to be reorganized." She paused. "It is a very large amount of work for one person." "It sounds like it is," he said. She looked at him steadily. "I told you about my significant problem," she said. "You did," he said. "I should tell you," she said, and she was choosing her words with care but also with the directness that was as natural to her as breathing, "that I have never been a woman who asks for things she is not sure she wants. I am sure about very few things at the moment, but there are some I am sure about." "Tell me," he said. "I am sure that you are a good man," she said. "I am sure that the past 3 days have been, despite everything, the least alone I have felt in 8 months. I am sure that I would like to know you better, and that 340 acres in the hill country of central Texas is not so different from the land in Abilene, in terms of what a person might build there." He was looking at her with that open, still expression, like a man in the presence of something he has been hoping for but was not certain would come. "Letitia," he said. "Yes," she said. "I have been heading to Abilene for 3 weeks," he said. "I have been heading there because I did not have anywhere else I was needed. I would very much like to go to a limestone ranch house in the hill country instead, if the invitation is genuine." "It is genuine," she said. He nodded once like a man who has made a decision and is at peace with it. "Then I will not go to Abilene," he said. She looked at him, this man who had walked beside her through 3 days of something difficult and had asked nothing in return except to be present, who had listened to everything she said and remembered the pecan grove and the October light, who looked at her like she was something real and worth looking at. "I am not asking you to stay because I need someone to run the ranch," she said, because this was important to say clearly. "I can run the ranch. I have been running things on my own for 8 months. "I know," he said. "I am asking you to stay because I want you there," she said, "because I would like to find out what this is properly without the urgency of legal trouble forcing the pace." "That is a very honest thing to say," he said. "I am a very honest person," she said. "I know," he said. "It is one of my favorite things about you." She looked at him one more time, and then she did something she had not done in a very long time. She reached out and took his hand. His hand was large and calloused and warm, and his fingers closed around hers with the careful, deliberate quality that was characteristic of everything he did. And they stood there on the boardwalk outside the Redemption Creek land office in the full August morning light. And Letitia Holloway felt something she recognized, finally, as the beginning of something. They left Redemption Creek the following morning, with their horses packed and Mrs. Delacroix's farewell cornbread wrapped in a cloth in Letitia's saddlebag, and the old men on the porch watching them go with the quiet approval of people who have seen enough of the world to know a good thing when it rides past. The road south toward the hill country was long and dusty and hot, as roads in Texas in August tend to be, and they rode it side by side, talking and sometimes not talking, and both were equally comfortable. Ezekiel had asked before they left if he should ride ahead or behind, which was such a practical question that she had looked at him for a second before realizing he meant it. "Beside," she had said. "Always beside." He had nodded like that was the right answer, which it was. They stopped the first night at a way station along the road, a simple overnight stop run by a Mexican family who provided a clean barn and a good supper of beans and tortillas and salt pork. And Letitia sat across the fire from Ezekiel and watched him talking to the children of the family, 3 small, curious children who had appeared from nowhere and were climbing on everything in the vicinity. He spoke to them easily and without condescension, and when the smallest one, a girl of about 4, held out a fistful of wildflowers to him with the solemn generosity of small children, he received them with grave and genuine gratitude and stuck them in the band of his cavalry hat and kept them there for the rest of the evening. Letitia thought about her father, who had always said that you could tell everything about a person by how they treated people who had no power over them. She thought he would have liked Ezekiel Monroe. The second day of riding brought them into the beginning of the hill country, where the landscape began to change from the flat, baked expanse of the open range into something more textured and particular, rolling limestone hills covered in cedar and live oak, creek bottoms thick with pecans and sycamores, the air beginning to carry a different quality, cooler and more resinous, smelling of cedar sap and thin water. Letitia felt her chest open wider with every mile, the way a person's body recognizes home before the mind quite catches up. "There," she said in the late afternoon of the second day, pointing at a limestone ridge with a line of old pecans along its base. "We are on the property now." Ezekiel looked where she pointed and was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "It is beautiful." "Yes," she said, "it is." They crossed the creek at the south boundary, the horses' hooves splashing in clear, shallow water over white limestone, and rode up the long slope of the main pasture toward the house. And as they crested the rise and the house came into view, Letitia felt something move through her that was too large for a single name. The limestone house sat on a flat above the creek, its wide porch facing west as she had described, its windows catching the late light. It looked smaller than she remembered and more solid. It looked like the place where her father had lived his whole adult life and made something real of nothing. She stopped her horse on the rise and looked at it for a long moment. Ezekiel stopped beside her without being asked. "My father built the east wall himself," she said. "You can see where the stones are a little uneven there at the corner. He said it was the first wall he had ever built and he learned as he went." "He learned well," Ezekiel said. "He did," she said. "He usually did." She rode down to the house. The ranch hands who had stayed on, 3 of them, came out when she arrived, and there was a reunion that involved a considerable amount of relief on everyone's part. The eldest of them, a man named Reuben who had worked for her father for 20 years and who looked at Letitia with the uncomplicated loyalty of someone who had been doing a job well out of love rather than pay, shook her hand and said, "We held it, Miss Holloway. Prute's man came out and tried to move some cattle last month, but we did not let him." "I know you held it," she said. "Thank you, Reuben." Reuben looked at Ezekiel with the assessing gaze of a man who had spent decades evaluating horses and men with equal care. "This is Ezekiel Monroe," Letitia said. "He helped in Redemption Creek." Reuben looked at Ezekiel for another moment, then nodded with the slight but definitive approval of a man whose opinion was worth something. "Good," he said. "We could use an extra hand." Ezekiel looked at Letitia, and Letitia said, "He is not hired help, Reuben." Reuben looked between them. The corners of his eyes crinkled. "No," he said with something very like satisfaction, "I did not think so." The weeks that followed were the fullest weeks Letitia had known in years. There was an enormous amount to do, and she threw herself into it with the energy of someone who has been fighting to get to the work and is relieved to finally be doing it. The cattle needed to be counted and the sick ones separated and treated. The accounts needed to be reconciled, since Prute had been using ranch funds for his own purposes and the books were a tangle. The fencing needed attention in 3 places. The house needed a new section of roof on the north end where a branch had come down in a spring storm. Ezekiel was there for all of it. Not in the way of a man taking over, but in the way of a man who was good at working and who applied that skill wherever it was useful. He was skilled with cattle, which she had expected given his years on the drives, and he and Reuben developed within the first week a working relationship built on the mutual respect of 2 competent men who recognized competence in each other. He helped with the fencing. He helped with the roof, which required someone with long arms to manage the upper beams, and he spent 2 days on that job with his hat off and his sleeves rolled up in the late summer heat. And Letitia told herself very firmly that she had more important things to look at than the line of his shoulders against the pale Texas sky. She had a great many important things to look at. She was looking at the accounts when he brought her coffee at mid-morning, and she was looking at the cattle when he appeared at her shoulder to point out a heifer that was limping on the far side of the pasture, and she was looking at the stars from the west-facing porch in the evenings when he came and sat in the chair beside hers. The evenings became their time. After supper, which they took with Reuben and the other hands at the long table in the kitchen, they went to the porch, and there they talked in the way of people who are genuinely interested in each other and have an inexhaustible amount of things to say. They talked about the ranch's future, about the cattle breeds that might do best in the hill country, about the possibility of adding a kitchen garden on the south side of the house where the light was good. They talked about books, because it turned out they had both grown up in families that valued reading, and there was considerable debate about the merits of various novels that she had brought from San Antonio and kept on the shelf in the parlor. They talked about harder things too. Ezekiel talked about his father's death with more detail one evening, the fence-line dispute that had been about pride as much as land, the neighbor who had been technically within the law and morally entirely wrong, the way his father had died not from violence, but from the drawn-out defeat of a man who had lost the thing he built his life on. He talked about it without self-pity but not without grief, and Letitia listened with the same quality of attention he had always given her, and when he finished she said, "I am sorry. He deserved better." "Yes," Ezekiel said, "he did, but I think he would have understood what it means to be here." She looked at him. "What does it mean to be here?" she asked. He looked at her with that open, direct quality. "It means I am somewhere I want to be," he said, "with someone I want to be with, doing work that matters. I have not had all three of those things at once before." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I have not had any of those things in a long time. I had the land and the work, but the rest of it." She paused. "I did not know how much I had been missing the rest of it." He reached out and took her hand in the dark of the porch, and she let him, and they sat like that for a while with the hill country night around them, the insects loud, the stars abundant, the air beginning to have that slight coolness that signals the first edge of the coming autumn. "Letitia," he said. "Yes," she said. "I would like to court you properly," he said. "I know we have been here 2 weeks, and I know the circumstances were unusual, and I am not trying to rush anything. But I want to be clear about what my intentions are." She looked at him in the dark. "Your intentions," she said. "Yes," he said. "I intend to continue getting to know you and to make myself useful here in ways that are genuine rather than strategic, and to eventually, when it is right, ask you a very important question." She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "That is very forward of you, Ezekiel Monroe." "Yes, ma'am," he said. "I have been called a forthright man." "By whom?" she asked. "Reuben told me this morning that I was forthright," he said. "He also said I was tolerable on a horse and better than average at reading a steer's condition. I thought those were all good signs." She laughed. The real one, the short and surprised one that she had laughed in front of him only once before, in the street in Redemption Creek with the peppermint candy. He looked at her with the same expression he had worn then, that open and startled warmth. "Yes," she said, when the laugh had settled. "You may court me properly, Ezekiel Monroe." The autumn came to the hill country in the way she had described to him, in gold and slow light through the pecan grove along the creek, in mornings that smelled of wood smoke and cooling earth, in afternoons that were warm rather than punishing, in evenings that called for the addition of a shawl on the west porch. October arrived, and with it a quality of light that Letitia had told him about on the main street of Redemption Creek, and the first afternoon it arrived fully, filtering golden and thick through the pecan branches above the creek. She looked up from the harness she was repairing to find Ezekiel standing at the edge of the grove, looking at it. He looked at it for a long time. Then he looked at her. "You were right," he said. It is exactly what you said. I know, she said. My father was right about it too. He came and sat beside her on the log where she was working, and he looked at the light in the pecan trees, and she looked at him looking at it, and she thought that this was a man who paid attention to things, and that this was a quality she intended to value for a very long time. He kissed her for the first time that afternoon in the pecan grove in the October light, with the creek running quietly nearby and the smell of fallen leaves around them. It was not a sudden thing. It was the kind of thing that had been building for weeks, and that arrived with the naturalness of something that was always going to happen, just waiting for the right moment. He turned toward her and she was already turned toward him, and there was a very brief and wordless exchange between their expressions, something that asked and answered at once, and then he leaned in with his characteristic deliberateness and kissed her softly and carefully, and with the same quality of full attention he brought to everything. She kissed him back. She put her hand against his jaw where she had noticed the line of it so many times before, and felt the warmth of his skin and the slight roughness of the afternoon stubble. And she thought with the clear and simple certainty of someone who has stopped second-guessing themselves that she was very glad she had nearly walked into his chest in the Silver Spur Saloon in Redemption Creek. When they separated, he rested his forehead against hers briefly, and she closed her eyes, and the pecan grove was very golden around them, and the creek was very quiet, and the October light was doing exactly what she had told him it would do. "There is the rest of it," she said softly. "Yes," he said. "There it is." They walked back to the house together through the golden afternoon, and Reuben, who was mending fence near the barn gate, watched them come through the gap in the pecan grove with an expression of deep and uncomplicated satisfaction, and said nothing at all, which was the most eloquent thing he could have done. The winter settled over the hill country with the mild gentleness of Central Texas winters, which are not the bitter affairs of the northern territories, but carry their own quality of cold clarity, blue skies and sharp mornings and nights that require blankets and fires. Letitia ran the ranch with the confidence of someone who had always known how to do it but had not recently had the opportunity, and Ezekiel worked beside her and learned the particular rhythms of the Holloway land with the attentiveness he brought to everything. He was a quick learner. He had an instinct for cattle and for land, and Reuben, who gave approval as sparingly as most men gave gold, told Letitia one morning in December that Monroe was the best judge of a range condition he had seen in 20 years of working hill country. "He sees the land the way your father did," Reuben said, which was the highest praise he had in him. Letitia knew it. The legal matter of Chester Prout resolved itself that winter in the way of such things, slowly and through proper channels. The state attorney general's office pursued the fraudulent document case, and Prout was charged formally in November, the notary alongside him. The proceedings were handled in Austin, and Letitia was not required to travel there, as her documentation had been thorough enough to serve the case without her personal testimony. She received a letter in December from Judge Whitmore saying that Prout had accepted a plea arrangement that involved formal acknowledgement of the fraud, a monetary penalty, and permanent prohibition from operating as a land agent in the state of Texas. It was, Judge Whitmore wrote, a satisfying outcome, even if the law had not been as swift or as definitive as justice would have liked. Letitia read the letter at the kitchen table and then set it down and sat with it for a moment. Ezekiel was across the table working on the accounts with her, a task they had fallen into doing together because he was better at the arithmetic and she was better at the categorization, and between them it went faster. He looked up when she set the letter down. She slid it across to him. He read it, and when he looked up his expression was a quiet, solid satisfaction that matched exactly what she was feeling. "It is over," she said. "Yes," he said. "It is over." She thought of her father. She thought of his meticulous records, his careful will, his trust in a justice that had eventually arrived, late and imperfect but present. She thought that he had deserved to see this, and was glad that she could. She reached across the table and took Ezekiel's hand, and he held it, and they sat for a while at the kitchen table with the winter afternoon light coming in through the windows and the account books open and the letter from Judge Whitmore between them, and it was one of the most peaceful moments she had known. On a December evening, when the first real cold of the season had arrived and the fire in the parlor was doing its best work, Ezekiel came to the porch where Letitia was standing with her shawl pulled tight, looking at the last light on the western hills. "You will freeze standing out here," he said, coming to stand beside her. "I wanted to see the last light," she said. "Come see it with me." He came and stood beside her, and they watched the light do what it does in December evenings, going from amber to deep rose to a thin line of gold at the very rim of the world before it was gone. "I have been thinking," he said when the light was gone. "About," she said. He turned to face her. In the dark of the porch, with just the lamplight from the parlor window, she could see his expression clearly enough to read it, which was open and deliberate and very serious in the way he was when something mattered most. "I have been here for 4 months," he said. "I have not gone to Abilene. I have not looked at land anywhere else. I have not thought about being anywhere else." He paused. "I think you know what I want to ask you." "I think I do," she said. "I want to ask it correctly," he said, and he reached into the pocket of his coat and brought out a small ring, plain gold with a small garnet set in it, which she could see had been bought thoughtfully rather than extravagantly, which was entirely consistent with who he was. "I bought this in town 2 weeks ago. I have been waiting for the right moment." He looked at her with everything he was showing on his face. "Letitia Holloway, I love you. I have loved you since you walked into the Silver Spur Saloon and sat in the corner chair because you did not trust the room. I would like to marry you, if you will have me, and I would like to spend the rest of my life learning this land and working alongside you, and sitting on this porch and watching every October light in those pecan trees for as long as we are given." She looked at him. She looked at the ring in his hand and at his face and at the dark hills behind him and at the stars that were beginning to come out in the winter sky. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I will marry you." He put the ring on her finger, and it fit as if it had been made for her, which perhaps it had. He took her face in both his hands and kissed her there on the cold December porch, and she put her arms around him and kissed him back with everything she had, which was considerable, because she was not a woman who did things by halves. When they went inside, Reuben was sitting by the kitchen fire with a cup of coffee, and he looked at the ring on Letitia's hand and then at Ezekiel and then at his coffee and said, "Took long enough," and they both laughed, and it was warm in the kitchen and cold outside, and the fire was very bright. They were married in March of 1879, in the parlor of the Limestone Ranch house, with Judge Whitmore making the journey down from Austin as both witness and officiant, because he had been her father's friend for 30 years, and because he told Letitia in the letter confirming his attendance that he would not have missed it for anything. Reuben stood up with them, and the other 2 ranch hands, a young man named Samuel and a quiet older man named Pete, were there as well, and Mrs. Delacroix sent down a bottle of wine from Redemption Creek, along with a note that said she had seen it coming the day they checked in, which Letitia absolutely believed. The ceremony was simple and genuine, which was what they both wanted, and the vows they said to each other were the ones that had been said in that country for 100 years, words about fidelity and love and partnership, and they said them to each other with the full attention and seriousness that they brought to everything. Judge Whitmore, who had married a great many couples in his time, said afterward that he had rarely seen 2 people more certain. Spring came to the hill country in its lavish way, with bluebonnets across the lower pasture and the creek running full and clear from the winter rains, and the cattle doing well in the green grass, and the pecan trees beginning to leaf out in that particular pale green that is one of the most hopeful colors in the world. Letitia and Ezekiel Monroe ran the Holloway Ranch together in the full sense of the word, which meant that every major decision was made by both of them, and every major piece of work was undertaken by both of them, And the balance between them was not the kind of balance that requires constant negotiation, because it had been established from the beginning on the correct ground of mutual respect. The ranch prospered. The cattle operation grew steadily over the first 2 years of their marriage, not dramatically but solidly, in the way of things built on good foundations. Ezekiel never spoke of the land in Abilene again, not as a lost thing, but because it had simply stopped existing as a thing he wanted. He had found something better. He told Letitia this one evening in the first summer of their marriage, when they were sitting on the west porch watching the sun go down over the hills, and she had looked at him with that green-eyed directness of hers and said, "I am glad you were passing through Redemption Creek." "So am I," he said, "every day." In the autumn of 1880, as the pecans began to turn and the October light returned to the grove along the creek, Letitia and Ezekiel's first child arrived, a boy they named Daniel, for her father, and for the weight of that name and the man who had carried it. He was born in the limestone house on a cool October morning, with the light coming through the bedroom windows in that golden way that Ezekiel had been made to understand, was something approaching the sacred. And he held his son in the hour after his birth with an expression that Letitia, watching from the bed, recognized as something she had no word for in any language she knew, which was the look of a man in the presence of more goodness than he had expected the world to give him. She reached out and put her hand on his arm, and he looked at her, and the look between them was everything. Reuben, informed of the birth by Samuel, who had gone to fetch him from the bunkhouse, appeared in the doorway of the bedroom, looked at the baby and at Ezekiel and at Letitia, and said, "His grandfather would have been very happy." And then he went back to the bunkhouse and left them to it, which was exactly the right thing to do. Daniel Holloway Monroe grew into a serious, wide-eyed child who walked the ranch at his father's heel from the time he could walk and developed opinions about cattle before he could reliably pronounce the word. He had Letitia's green eyes and Ezekiel's dark hair, and the combination was startling and beautiful. He was not a quiet child. He had questions about everything and asked them without pause, which delighted Ezekiel and occasionally exhausted Letitia, and which both of them privately considered to be exactly the right quality in a child who was going to inherit 340 acres of hill country. A daughter came 3 years later, in the spring of 1883, born in the same limestone house on a warm morning, with the creek running high from early rains and the bluebonnets already in the lower pasture. They named her Clara, after no one in particular, because the name suited her from the first moment she arrived, which was with the definitive and vocal announcement of a person who intended to be noticed. She had Ezekiel's amber eyes and Letitia's jaw, set with exactly that quality of quiet determination, and Ezekiel looked at her in the first minutes of her life and said to Letitia, "She is going to be a great deal like you." "Is that a problem?" Letitia asked. "It is the best possible thing I can imagine," he said. The years settled into the ranch and became part of it, accumulated the way limestone layers in a creek bed accumulate, slowly and without drama, but with a steadiness that is its own kind of beauty. Daniel learned to ride and to read range condition and to keep accounts, because his mother insisted on the accounts. Clara learned all the same things and additionally became, by the time she was 5, the most opinionated person within 20 miles on the subject of which horses were sound and which were not, which was saying something in a community where horses were taken seriously. Letitia ran the ranch with the same clear-eyed capability she had always had, and with the additional confidence of someone who had fought for the thing she ran, and knew its value not just in acres and cattle, but in the deeper terms of what it meant and what it held. She was known in the surrounding community as a fair dealer and a practical woman, and the neighboring ranchers, who had at first regarded her with the slight wariness that the time and place tended to direct at women running their own operations, came to regard her with the respect that competence, demonstrated consistently over years, always eventually earns. Ezekiel was known as a good man, which is a simple thing and not a small one. He was known for his word being reliable, and his assessment of land and cattle being honest, and his willingness to help when help was needed. He and Reuben remained the steady center of the ranch operation, and when Reuben's joints began to trouble him in the winter cold, Ezekiel quietly took on more of the physically demanding work without comment, and Reuben remained on as the authority on every cattle question, which was where his real value had always been. One evening in the autumn of 1884, when Daniel was 4 and Clara was just over a year old, and the October light was doing its annual thing in the pecan grove along the creek, Letitia and Ezekiel sat on the west porch after the children were in bed. In the rocking chairs they had put out there to replace the original two that had finally given up, and they sat in the comfortable quiet that comes from years of conversation between people who know each other well. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if you had not been in Redemption Creek that summer?" Letitia asked. He considered it for a moment. "Sometimes," he said. "I think I would have gone to Abilene and looked at that land and found it inadequate for reasons I could not have named. And I would have won my case anyway," she said, "because the evidence was sufficient." "Yes," he agreed, "you would have. So we were not necessary to each other's survival," she said, "just to each other's everything else." He looked at her. The evening light was kind to both of them, to the laugh lines that had settled at the corners of her eyes and the slight weathering that years of outdoor work had given his face, to the gray that was beginning at his temples, and the way her chestnut hair caught the light when it came loose from its pins, which it invariably did by evening. "Everything else," he said, "is considerably more than survival." She reached over and took his hand, the way she had taken it on the boardwalk outside the Redemption Creek Land Office on a hot August morning in 1878, and he held it with the same careful warmth he had always held it with, and they looked out at the western hills as the last of the October light faded from them. The children grew and the ranch prospered, and the years did what years do when the ground under them is solid, which is accumulate into something that looks, in retrospect, like a life well made. Daniel, at 10, was taking his first turns at riding fence with Reuben, who had slowed but had not stopped, and who took considerable pleasure in teaching the boy the things he had learned over 50 years of working cattle. Clara, at 7, had already decided that she was going to run the ranch herself someday, and had informed Daniel of this fact with the calm authority of someone who considers the matter settled. And Daniel had received this information with the slightly mystified equanimity of an older sibling who has learned that arguing with Clara is a losing proposition. Ezekiel and Letitia watched their children with the particular love of parents who are genuinely interested in who their children are becoming, and they talked about it on the porch in the evenings, and they disagreed sometimes in the productive way of people who are both paying attention and who respect each other's perspective. And they worked things out through conversation in the honest, straightforward way that had characterized their relationship from the first weeks in Redemption Creek. In the spring of 1886, Letitia found herself standing in the pecan grove along the creek on a morning when the new leaves were just coming in, pale and hopeful, and she looked up at the branches against the blue sky and thought about her father. She thought about him often still, not with the raw grief of the first years, but with something that had become softer and more settled, a sustained love for a person who was gone and whom she continued to know, in the way that the dead remain known to those who loved them. She heard Ezekiel step behind her and felt him come to stand beside her in the way he always did, present without crowding, attentive without pressing. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she said. "Daniel is trying to convince Reuben to let him try the roan filly," he said. "Reuben is holding firm." "Reuben is right," she said. "The filly is too green." "I know," he said. "I told Daniel the same thing. He took it better from me." "He takes things better from you sometimes," she said, "because you are not his mother. Give him a few years and he will take them better from you all the time." "Will that bother you?" he asked. "No," she said. "It will mean I raised him right." He was quiet beside her for a moment, looking up at the new leaves. Then he said, "What are you thinking about?" "My father," she said. "I think he would have liked this spring." "He always liked the springs." "He would have liked all of this," Ezekiel said. "I think he would have been very glad." "Yes," she said, "I think he would." She leaned into him slightly, and his arm came around her in the easy way of long habit, and they stood together in the pecan grove with the new leaves above them and the creek running nearby, and the sound of Daniel arguing with Reuben carrying faintly on the morning air. And the hill country spring around them was as close to that thing her father had described as she knew how to reach. Just that particular quality of light, without the end of it. They walked back to the house together through the grove, and the morning was full and clear, and the ranch was real and theirs, and the children were alive and loud in the way of healthy children. And Ezekiel Monroe walked beside her through the green Texas spring with his hand in hers, as he had done for 8 years, and intended to do for all the years that remained. On the west porch of the limestone house that evening, with Daniel doing his lessons at the kitchen table, and Clara already asleep with the decisive efficiency of a child, who decides everything with the same firmness, Letitia and Ezekiel sat in the last light, as they always did, and the sun went down over the western hills in the colors that only the hill country can produce, and the evening came in cool and fragrant with cedar and spring grass, and the stars began to appear one by one. And the cricket song started, and the creek could be heard distantly, and everything was as it should be. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" he asked. "For being in Redemption Creek," she said. "For walking into the Silver Spur Saloon at the right moment. For sitting down across from me at that table and asking if I was all right." He looked at her. His amber eyes in the evening light were warm and steady and entirely focused on her, as they had been from the very beginning. "Thank you for letting me stay," he said. She squeezed his hand. The evening settled around them, and the limestone house was warm behind them with lamplight and the muffled sounds of a household at rest. And the hill country night came in with all its generous darkness and its extraordinary stars. And Letitia Holloway Monroe and Ezekiel Monroe sat on the west-facing porch of the house that her father had built, and held on to each other, and were home. All of it had begun because she had walked into a saloon in a dusty Texas town looking for a dangerous man, and a different man entirely had asked if she was all right, and she had told him she was managing, and he had understood exactly what that meant and had stayed anyway. All of it had begun because 2 people had sat down across from each other in a corner table with their separate purposes and their separate grief, and had found, improbably and thoroughly, each other. All of it had grown from that first afternoon into 8 years and 2 children and 340 acres of limestone and cedar and pecan grove and west-facing porch, and from the promise of all the years still to come. The hill country received all of it without comment, as it had received everything before and would receive everything after, which is the nature of land that has been standing longer than any of us and will stand longer still. The creek ran over its white limestone bed. The deer came to the spring-fed pond at dawn. The pecans turned gold in October. The bluebonnets came back every spring to the lower pasture, reliable as anything in this world. And on the west-facing porch in the last light of every good evening, 2 people sat and held hands and were glad of it, and that was everything, and it was enough.